Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another set of videos in which we continue to learn about finance and operation. In my previous video, I had actually talked the difference between Business Central and finance and operation, and there's quite a bit of videos that I've created for Business Central in order for you to start going into the ERP cloud solution and a career. So Business Central is always good to have the foundational understanding if you don't know the finance or accounting aspect of a business, for instance, and you're learning not just from a textbook, but from a process perspective, from a cloud solution perspective, then Business Central would be the best way to go. And then once you have a strong foundation of accounting and finance, then it'd be good to move into the finance and operations space because this is a lot bigger module. A lot of things are involved, and a lot of team members are involved in configuring the system. So no one person can configure everything in finance and operations, so which is why you have subject matter experts in your teams. So the continuation of the last meeting or last video that I had actually created, we're going to talk about human resources. So if you were to go into the modules and go into human resources, we're just going to glance through some of the important parameters that you need to configure in the system and what those parameters actually mean. And then we'll continue to move into creating employees and all the interesting stuff that human resources actually allow you to do from the systems perspective and the things that it needs to improve, of course, based on my experience that I've had with other clients. One of the pro tips that I would like to give you if you're a starter and if you don't know much about finance and operation, and this is your learning um, video, then the first thing would be to actually uh, pin this. Always useful to pin something that you will be navigating through all the time. So I simply like to actually pin this all the time. I give that tip to all my clients during the demo. It just helps in a sense to actually navigate instead of populating it back and forth. So let's get into the actual human resource parameters. So go into the modules, click on human resources, and go into the setup. There are two human resources parameters that you need to worry about. So let's go into the first one, which is company specific. So this human resource parameter is company specific. That means any parameter that we set here has no impact on the other legal entities. So as you could see, the DAT is my legal entity. If I had more legal entities, there will be more of them in a drop-down menu. So these parameters do not have any impact on that legal entity. The only one that I for a fact know is super important is the default identification number. Of course, you can read a little bit more about the other parameters, but they don't play too much of a role. Really depends on the requirements of a client. But the default identification number, for instance, is an absolute must just because different organizations have different identifications. So you can configure that from this drop-down menu. So in our case, at least in Canada, social insurance number is a identification number, which is very unique. Driver's license is a unique thing, a unique identifier of an individual. So it depends on the requirements what they use, and this will come up when you're actually hiring a worker. So right under above the default identification number, there's a statement called hire worker. And so every time you hire a worker, whatever the default identification number that we select, that will pop up on that. So we'll also go through that process as well as hiring at some point. So the way you can actually configure is either go into human resources, go into the setup, and then go into the identification number, or we left click on this, go in view details. And this is where you can configure and add new identifications. In here, you can also put in the length that you need for that specific identification. So driver's licenses, for instance, have a set of uh, 10 characters or 10 digits, for instance, and it can be a mixture of digits and alphabets. So all of that can be configured. So allowed values, for instance, is like numbers and letters or numbers only. So SIN number, in our case, social insurance numbers are always numbers only, and it'll give you a length of that. And once a uh, employee is hired for a position, then you will be asked from a HR manager perspective or a hiring manager perspective to have or to insert the identification number here. So at that stage of hiring, you will have to insert that, and because it will become mandatory. So that's one way of actually putting it, identification number there, so you can configure that. Moving on to like recruitment, so you can create some document management related things here. You can configure it based on the requirement. Recruiting email accounts. So if you have some integration established with other providers where you're actually doing applicant tracking, for instance, so you can use these email addresses for that. So that's a hefty activity where you have to integrate. So not much what you can do here unless it's absolutely necessary and there's an integration involved with recruiting. So the recruiting does not happen in finance and operation currently. We will have the merger happening soon this year in 2022, later in the year, in the summer, more or less in November, late in November. So once that happens, then we'll have more functionality available in human resources. But that also means that recruitment is still not part of it, unfortunately. The ATS system that was being used, is LinkedIn Talent Hub, is being decommissioned, so maybe a replacement might be coming in at some point. So compensation, so not much here that you can do. Human resources parameters, well, doesn't really have much that you can put in. This is mostly for reporting, I guess, when you have Power BI reports and you can use this rating source. So not that I've used it, to be honest. I've actually created compensation grids, which we'll talk about from the human resource module. But nothing's too specific that you need to worry about, to be honest. It won't impact any system or any processes. Number sequences, that's important just because you want to make sure that the number sequences that you use with the help of your client, of course, is applicable. For instance, course ID. So in a course ID, you need to make sure that every time you create a course, then an ID is associated with it and the number sequence is associated with it. So it could be a different number sequences related to that. So in order for you to configure that, simply go into the course ID, left click on there, click on view details. So there's one that in the organization administration, and you can go into the number sequence there, and then you'll see the same form. So if I go in view details, I should be able to configure the number sequence here. So it is also very flexible. So you have alphanumeric segments here. You can have constants that you can insert. So if you want to insert a letter, for instance, prior or later in the end of the value, you can do that. And you have to assign the number sequence to something. So the reference is where you need to assign it to. So if you add, you need to assign it to the actual module, and then the reference is where, and specifically you're mapping it to where you're going to be conducting and using this number sequence. And here you have to make sure that the smallest number is 1, and you can give a largest number. The largest number actually is interrelated or dependent on the length here. So you'll probably get an error if the length is 7 and the largest number is like 6 digits, for instance, I believe. So that will probably give you an error because it has to actually go hand in hand. So just to avoid that error, make sure that you know the length that you're using. Moving on to employee self-service. So this is basically if you are employed, you're given a team member license, and you can go into your self-service portal or workspace, and you'll have all these information available to you of yourself. We can show that at some point later. And the same thing with the manager self-service. So manager have their own self workspace, and you can configure using these options to understand that if as a manager, how many people are reporting to me and how many are open positions. So if you want to do view open positions, which are direct reports only, then they will show up on your workspace as a manager. Same thing with existing workers. If you want to show how many workers they are reporting to you currently, you can have that configured, and then you can go into the manager self-service workspace in order to view that information as well. So that is the human resource parameters for a specific legal entity. So the next video will touch base on the shared parameters, which is basically the parameters that are shared across multiple legal entities. And if you change in one, automatically the change is reflected on the other legal entity. So stay tuned for that, and then we'll talk about the human resource shared parameters in that video.